2 million people trapped on the Baltic coast with the Red Army closing in behind them. The only way out is the sea, mined, patrolled by submarines, and covered by almost no air support. The German Navy has 15 weeks to move them all. By January 1945, the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive had cut off East Prussia, Pomerania, and the Danzig corridor. Roads west were clogged with civilians on foot, families with handcarts, soldiers on crutches, children separated from parents in the dark. The ports were the last exit, and the window was shrinking by the day. On January 23rd, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz signed the order. The mission was blunt: remove wounded troops and civilians from the Baltic ports before the front reached the piers. 3 ports became the funnels: Gotenhafen, Danzig, and Pillau. Everything that could float was ordered east to load and west to unload, without pause. The Kriegsmarine scraped together anything with a hull and an engine. Liners, coasters, river tugs, minesweepers, torpedo boats, and fishing vessels were pressed into service. They shuttled between the eastern ports and Kiel, Lübeck, and Copenhagen. Port captains pulled skippers from reserve lists and stopped asking for peacetime papers. There were not enough lifeboats, not enough escorts, and not enough fuel, but the operation launched anyway. The loading at the piers was chaos, managed by exhaustion. Docks built for a few hundred passengers now took thousands. Medical teams tried to separate stretcher cases and children from the mass, but the crowd pushed through every barrier. Ships designed to carry 800 left with 5,000 or 6,000. Pursers stopped counting. The numbers that went into the logs were estimates at best. The Baltic itself was the next problem. The crossing to western ports was roughly 300 nautical miles, depending on the route. The water was mined, patrolled by Soviet submarines, and open to air attack. The Luftwaffe could offer almost no cover. Escort vessels were few and short on fuel. Convoys sailed dark and radio silent when possible, using short-coded signals when they had to communicate. Navigation was a choice between bad options. Hug the coast to avoid deep-water submarines, and you hit minefields. Go wide into open water, and you gave Soviet boats a clean firing solution. Most captains split the difference and relied on speed, darkness, and luck. Minesweepers cut lanes ahead of the convoys, but the lanes shifted as new mines were laid. In winter conditions, with ice forming on decks and rigging, even routine seamanship became dangerous. Ships that lost speed risked falling behind the convoy, and stragglers rarely had escort protection. Despite all of it, the ships kept running. A vessel that unloaded passengers at Lübeck turned around the same night and headed back east. Crews slept in their oilskins on deck. When the embarkation siren sounded at a pier, the next ship was already warping in. The operation worked because it never stopped. Not for weather, not for losses, and not for the news that came on January 30th. On the evening of January 30th, the Wilhelm Gustloff sailed from Gotenhafen. She was a former cruise liner, now painted gray, and serving as a troop transport and barracks ship. She carried no hospital markings and no legal protection. Estimates of the number aboard range from 6,000 to over 10,000. The true figure will never be known. She had one escort torpedo boat. That night, the Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesko, was patrolling near Stolpebank. Marinesko tracked the Gustloff's silhouette against the winter sky and fired 4 torpedoes. 3 struck the ship. The first hit forward, the second amidships, the third near the engine room. The liner lost power and began to list. Lifeboats were frozen in their davits. Passengers who reached the open deck found ice-covered railings, and a ship tilting away from them. The Gustloff sank in under an hour. The water temperature was around 2 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill an unprotected person in minutes. Rescue vessels reached the site and pulled survivors from rafts and wreckage, but most of those in the water were already dead. Roughly 1,000 people were saved. The rest, somewhere between 5,000 and 9,000, died in the Baltic. It remains the single greatest loss of life in a maritime disaster in recorded history. The evacuation did not stop. 10 days later, S-13 struck again. The General von Steuben, carrying roughly 4,500 wounded soldiers and refugees, was torpedoed near the same waters. She sank with most of those aboard. Marinesko had now sunk 2 major transports in less than 2 weeks. In mid-April, the transport Goya was torpedoed by the Soviet submarine L-3 off the Hel Peninsula. She went down in minutes. Roughly 6,900 people were killed, the second deadliest sinking in history after the Gustloff. 3 ships sunk, somewhere around 15,000 to 20,000 dead, and the convoys kept sailing. By late March, Danzig and Gotenhafen had fallen to the Red Army. The evacuation funneled down to the Hel Peninsula, a narrow spit of land that became the last usable pier on the coast. Artillery fire could reach the embarkation points, and the approaches were mined. Minesweepers led convoys out of the narrowing channel and came back scarred but still floating. Ships loaded under shell fire and sailed into mined water in the dark. The crews who ran those routes knew that each crossing could be the last. By early May, the operation shifted from evacuation to surrender. The last sailings left Hel for German and Danish ports as the war ended. Some of the final ships crossed with Soviet aircraft overhead and mines still active in the water. Ships tied up at Kiel and Lübeck and unloaded passengers into camps and railheads that were already under British control. The numbers are staggering, even by the standards of the Eastern Front. Between late January and early May 1945, the Kriegsmarine moved roughly 2 to 2.5 million people across the Baltic. That is roughly 7 times the number evacuated from Dunkirk in 1940, carried out over 15 weeks instead of 9 days. The operation saved the majority of those who reached the ports. But the cost was enormous. Tens of thousands died in the sinkings, in the minefields, and in the water. The evacuation remains one of the least known major operations of the war. It was carried out by a navy that was losing on behalf of a regime that had started the war. That same regime had caused the catastrophe that made the evacuation necessary. No government wanted to celebrate it afterward. The Allied side had no reason to publicize a German naval achievement. Post-war Germany had little appetite for naval pride in any form, and the Soviet Union had no interest in drawing attention to the sinking of ships full of refugees. The result is that one of the largest rescue operations of the war is still largely absent from popular accounts. What made it work was not heroism, but scheduling. Ships ran continuous loops between east and west, while port crews loaded around the clock. Minesweepers cleared lanes that shifted daily, and escort captains burned fuel they could not replace. The system held because no one waited for conditions to improve. They sailed with what they had when they had it. 2 million people crossed a mined, submarine-patrolled sea in 15 weeks. The ships that carried them are mostly forgotten. The ones that sank are remembered only because of how many people died. If you like real stories from the Second World War, like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The next one is coming.